наша славная Родина, ее свобода.
Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
Many years ago, when I was first seriously getting into this hobby of board gaming, I went, well, what are the best board games? And naturally, I looked at the BGG top 10, and at the top was Twilight Struggle. And Twilight Struggle was the king of BGG for 6 years, which is an incredibly long time, and is still at number 13, 20 years after its release. Yes, this is a 20-year-old game. So where does this game stand now today? Well, first, what the heck is Twilight Struggle? This is a game in the Cold War across 45 years, where it's all about the world going the American way or the Soviet way. In gameplay terms, you are pushing each country to your political influence, trying to get control of regions as scoring cards come up. Everything comes from playing a card in your hand, all drawn from a single deck over 3 eras of gameplay. So you'll be playing yours and your opponent's cards, with rolling dice to launch coups in countries, playing monumental events such as these, and of course preventing Defcon from hitting 1 to blow up the world from nuclear warfare. Yeah, this is an epic game, but it's also not for the faint of heart. And remember, there's no denying it still has a steep following. After all, it's still getting many 9 and 10 out of 10 ratings today. It actually went up from spot 14 in 2023. Oh, by the way, this is 2 to 3 hours, but can end early with only 1v1 available. But hey, maybe it's the best 1v1 historical game ever created, as reviews from even this year are saying. By the way, I played this game 3 times, of course trying both sides, and the person I played it with, Alexander, has played this game over 20 times. Yeah, a lot to unpack here. Let's get into the how to play. By the way, this game calls turns a sequence of action rounds, which we're not going to go by because that's just too confusing for my sanity. So we're calling action rounds what they actually are, turns. So turns are normal turns, that's how we're calling it. And this turn record track will be discussing rounds. This is all for my sanity, okay? Deal with me. Please deal with me, please. The goal is to have more points than your opponent before the game ends after round 10. However, the game can end early if someone hits 20 points. They win the game. Or the world can explode if Defcon moves to 1, and it's your turn when that happens, you immediately lose. So first things first, we want to have control of countries, which is having a number at or higher than the stability number on the right. And if your opponent is there, subtract their influence from yours to check for control. Having countries will help you get points when these scoring cards come up from people's hands. Basically, you'll score points depending on how strong you are in that region, which is a collection of countries, or your opponent will score. So at the start of a round, you'll refill your hand to 9 cards. Then you'll headline, which means both players will play a card simultaneously to do the effect, then Soviets will trigger first. After that, you're on to the meat of the game, where you'll play a card from your hand. You'll have 4 main types of options. You can A, use a card for the effect. This is called using it as an event and can sometimes remove the card from the game. Or B, use a number at the top to place influence in a country. You can split it up across the board, placing somewhere you're currently at or adjacent to. Or C, you can use that same number to launch an alignment or coup in a region, but you roll dice and manipulate it versus a region's stability. High roll is better. And then lastly, D, discard the card to move up on the space race, which requires a specific roll to succeed. You'll keep playing cards one at a time amongst players until the round ends, which is 6 cards played each for the first round. But you may have realized that there's different colors at the top left corner. And say you're playing the Yankees, you're gonna draw the evil empire of Soviet Russia's cards.
We will bury them.
Well, you'll have to play these at some points, and if you try to get the value at the top left corner, the effect triggers. So you gotta balance how to play these. Also at the end of round 3, you'll shuffle the mid cards into the main deck, and end of round 7, you'll shuffle in the late game cards. If you run out of cards to draw, take the discard and shuffle it back in. Okay, one last thing is that there's something called military operation, where essentially both nations need to be doing enough military things around to have it equal Defcon. If it does not match Defcon, that player will lose VP equal to the difference come round end. That's it for now. Remember, the game can end early if someone hits 20 VP or Defcon 1. Component pros, and the first is that seeing the influence on the board is really easy, and thank goodness, because seeing the numbers is pretty much most of this game. The whole board just really pops with a contrasted color, and hey, there's a neat detail here how there's different leaders as the time advances. Oh, the cards that you're touching constantly are really thick in a good way. There's also a timeline of the entire Cold War on the side of the box. This is absolutely brilliant. Learning some stuff already here. Gameplay pros time. So let's first talk about how Twilight Struggle does the push and pull of influence of each country, whether it's going the American way or the Soviet way. It's just a very well done tug of war. To explain the system more, you can first only put down influence if you have an adjacent country with influence. And it's also twice as hard to put down influence if your opponent has control of it. This makes all adjacencies matter, as well as when you decide to commit to have control to deter your opponent. Like, there's a big emphasis on choke points for adjacencies, like Iran or France, where you can really see what each superpower's way of spreading influence is. Americans need Iran to spread into Southwestern Asia, and the Soviets need France to spread into Africa. This gets heightened how there's a distinction between battlegrounds versus the normal countries. So you have to decide those because battlegrounds mean more for VP calculation, but might not be calculated in convenient control for you right now. Another way of trying to get control of a place is by cooing, and you can only coup a battleground to get control, and you don't need an adjacency to do this. So you have to look out for your opponent wanting to coup a place you just captured. And you can anticipate coups because both players will have to do it to get military ops before the round ends to match Defcon. As an example, the Russians can stop the Americans from getting these military op VPs by refusing to spread influence into non-battleground countries outside of Europe and Asia and the Middle East, as your opponent now cannot coup without first raising Defcon, which would lose you the game if the board looks like this. Oh, by the way, you can't really coup in Europe because the restriction is if Defcon is at 4, which is really easy to do. So this makes a lot of intuitive sense. Like, imagine being able to coup the UK constantly. That would not make sense. The push and pull also changes throughout the game as you introduce the middle to late game cards, where even the mid game deck has more scoring cards introduced. Southeast Asia, for example, is maximally valuable at 1 point mid game, where the SEA scoring card is played, which deletes itself. And after that, the region isn't as useful. Or how Central and South America just are pretty largely empty until mid game, where its scoring card spawns. Then it's push and pull over things around the Fidel Castro area. If the push and pull of systems is the backbone of Twilight Struggle, then the soul of it would definitely be in all these cards. So now let's go down this rabbit hole, and oh my goodness, is it cool how they included all these historical events. Yes, these are all unique cards. I know this is gameplay pros, but the gameplay is directly lifted from these events, and it's really impressive on the variety here. There's military events, memorable political deals, propaganda campaigns, and even the rise of certain figures. I'm not a Cold War expert, but from everyone I've talked to and things I've read online, everything checks out thematically. And while most cards basically revolve around gaining or losing influence on certain countries on the board, the way they do this is pretty memorable. There's just some really striking character here. Let's take a war, for example. There's a simple Korean War where North Korea invades South Korea. South Korea gets buffed by having US controlled countries next to it. This all makes sense, and the card is deleted, never seen again. War only happens once. Contrast that with the Indo-Pakistani war here. You choose which one invades the other, and this happens again and again and again. It doesn't delete itself from the deck. Why does this make sense? Because these countries, they hate each other. Same with the Arab-Israeli war. That's still happening today. Again, there's just so many different cards here with no copies. So here are some of my favorite off the hip. Marshall Plan to airdrop American cash money all across Western Europe. Yes, I took high school in America.
Riding high.
Or Fidel to give USSR immediate control of Cuba. Or Kitchen Debates to literally poke your opponent in the chest and gain 2 VP. So by now you've probably seen that there are pro-America cards with the blue and white star and pro-Soviet cards with the red star. But if you're drawing all of them from the same deck, how does that work? And this is a key card play that is smart. Your hand is usually about 8 to 9 cards, with your cards, and then your opponent's favoring cards. And so you have to play almost all of your cards before the round ends. So much of the game is deciding when's the best time to dump your opponent's cards to give them the effect, while you take the number and do something with it. You're allowed to save some cards between rounds, so do you want to use that saving to save something you want, or to delay your opponent's strong event? And it's sort of a combined deck building, because many high op cards, aka strong cards like NATO and Warsaw Pact, are permanently removed from the game when they get played, meaning that side's total ops value, the number value on the top right, this value is getting lower in the deck. Essentially, you play the card as an event, and now that side's deck is a little bit weaker permanently. This leads to constant questions of how to play these cards, because playing your opponents means you gotta suck up the dreadful loss on the board now, with the hope that this will pay off in the deck being more in your favor late game. Or if you have a strong card to play for your side, when is the right time to delete that card and press the advantage on the board? Or should you milk the ops number a couple more times? A good sequence of tying together cards is, say the US really needs places to launch coups, so they play the Red Scare / Purge to -1 all the Soviet op number. This discourages the Soviets from using those op numbers on cards, so they're encouraged to use their spread op cards like desalinization and decolonization now, so they drop in Africa and South America. But Cameroon and Colombia are non-battleground countries that can get couped even if Defcon is at 2, so this allows America to launch a coup just like they planned. Thank goodness you're not totally trapped with your hand though, because there's a side game of the Space Race to discard a card to move up in the track. So that's another avenue you need to decide if it's worth discarding, since it's not directly affecting the board. This is also very important for discarding game losing cards, because remember, if it's your turn and a Defcon hits 1, you lose the game. You can use cards such as Grain Sales to Soviets to rip off a card off the Soviets' hand and force it to be played. Now the Soviets, who were relying on playing that card, are now forced to use a really powerful American event or Defcon self-lose via duck and cover or something else. The pressure on insta-losing the game via certain cards makes learning the cards very rewarding for high-level play. The fact that you can see every single card multiple times also does a good job of reducing card RNG, more specifically in the early to mid game, because since your opponent must play your cards eventually, and you will draw through the entire early game deck and probably the mid to late game deck, which you combine with the early game deck after deleting cards permanently from the game. Basically, the deck isn't that big and you see players constantly playing cards. Like, it's really telling how clear you can get with your guessing when we finished our game and Alex pointed to me and said, "Oh yeah, the card in your hand, it has to be CIA created because I didn't see that card yet." And yeah, I was holding on to this for the entire game. And once you're familiar with the cards players have, the headlining phase becomes more nuanced, because there are cards that will negate other headliners, while certain cards make for really good headliners, so they're predictable. Oh, also, those important scoring cards, well, you have to play them before a round ends, meaning that the moment you draw one, you have to immediately plan for dropping. And you're not going to be winning in those regions all the time. As such, you're thinking about when's the best time to drop it. Do you want to do it now and get out of the way and prevent your opponent from getting even more influence in that region to score them more points? Or do you want to pretend you don't have it and then drop it at the end of a round to surprise your opponent? This gets even trickier when you have multiple scoring cards in hand. The stress here from the Middle East and Asia, oh my gosh, the tension, and they're connected to on the map, so that makes certain countries even more important this round specifically. There's one card that operates a bit differently than the rest, the China card, which is actually a really cool design. It always starts with the Soviets, it's public info, they have to choose the trigger, but in doing so gives your opponent a chance to use it next. The China card is just a 2 VP swing to help break stalemates on the board, especially in Asia. And it's just historically fun. China is a wild card and all needs America versus USSR geopolitical dealings. This all just comes together for this to be a mechanical struggle for each region on the board, with pooling countries over to your ideology as you look at your hand of cards, many of which are bad for you, and see where you want to dedicate strength for that turn. And you can usually influence multiple countries per card played, so the decision space is huge. One last mechanic we have to emphasize is the military operations, where it's great counterplay how as players manipulate Defcon, both players also have to do military ops in order to not lose victory points at the end of rounds. Because as Defcon moves down, there's less places to do those military operations. So this adds a timing component to rounds where you want to get the appropriate military ops before the round ends. And as such, your opponent often wants to contain you to prohibit you from queuing before the round ends. The final pro is that Twilight Struggle is fantastic theme meets gameplay. I mean, with these decks of cards, this game would not work without this theme with these cards. And then again, the card strength is cool how they have the ops and also the printed event. And then you have certain battlegrounds like Iran and Thailand that are just hotly contested due to their adjacencies to others. Cuba is a great one too. The Soviets will get Cuba through the Fidel card, and the US just wants them out because it's a battleground country, which is valuable. And the US will have a slight boost because the US is adjacent, but it's just hard to get the Soviets out because it's a 3 stability country. Also, you can see how as the decades progress, emphasis on certain regions just changes, and it does feel like you're going from the post-World War II era to Nam, and even up to Reagan. Like, if you want to say, tear down this wall and add US influence in East Germany, you got that here. Or Reagan bombs Libya, because he did that. Or de Gaulle. J'adore l'odeur du napalm au petit déjeuner. So that's shown by him being pro-Soviet Union in this game. Or if you just want to call your opponent an evil empire, like I do constantly, here you go.
This will be messy.
Component cons time. And oh my goodness, is this, while the cheapest deluxe game I've ever bought, also the worst looking deluxe game I've ever seen. I really had to do a multiple takes on me ordering a deluxe game, but yep, it says on the box right here, deluxe edition. Again, good thing this wasn't expensive. This was about the same price as a normal board game, but it's just a weird thing to be calling this deluxe, I guess for me, the board gamer. Let's get into these fake feeling deluxe isms. There's no area to put any of the small tokens, so you just make up your own area somewhere on the map that isn't being used. Oh, and these tokens are small. Like, it's pretty much impossible to see the tiny text on them from afar. I call this the GMT special of having tiny text on tiny tokens like this. Also, our board kept standing up out of the box, so we had to play with paperweights, otherwise the control markers would be slipping and sliding. Some of the country connections, which you know how things are connected on map, are so hard to see, but more on this later. So what are the deluxe things you're getting as opposed to the normal version? Well, it's a handful of these new cards, and then the Chinese Civil War variant printed on the box. And then the board is sturdier than before, which I do agree, it is sturdy. By the way, it looks like it's purposefully dirty in these areas, not our coffee stains, okay? Again, we're approaching this from a board gamer point of view, maybe not a war gaming point of view. When we hear deluxe, we expect something a little bit more polished in terms of components, but at least they give you enough plastic bags to store everything. Oh, also these player aids, while wordy, are serviceable, and there's even a card list on the back if you're really hardcore about the game. There should also be some sort of way to keep track of players' control of regions, like a progress marker on the side of each region next to the VP payouts. That way you don't have to keep calculating what players have as you decide to drop scoring cards. Rather, you can just update this as players get control of regions. This would help newcomers a lot with this too, because presence versus domination versus control isn't exactly intuitive nor explained on the board. Some graphic design is just straight sad too. I mean, I know lots of them are just photographs, which is fine, that's how it is, but Latin America debt crisis, really? They couldn't have at least some money on here? CIA created, this is lazy, how about a photograph of the original director being appointed? Or now War Games is just clip art. That was a big transition from black and white images. Also, scoring cards are literally just a table. Come on, at least put the region art somewhere on here. While we're on that, it would be nice for non-geography savvy people to show the general location of countries mentioned by text on cards. And while I wasn't confused, I know people that would be when you say a country in Africa, they've probably only heard in passing, if at all. Then there's no number 9 on the influence markers, and while this is a bit of a nitpick because it doesn't always come up, sometimes you do need it, and then you have to combine numbers to make it, because 6 upside down looks weird. This actually happens more than you'd imagine because you almost always have an ops war with the other player where you dump on ops, like Thailand, Iran, India, Pakistan. Now, I haven't read the rulebook, and I'm just gonna trust Alex in saying that it's good and logical, but I have scanned through it, and it's not exactly a normal board game rulebook. It just has a GMT special of extremely dense writing and few diagrams. It's definitely not a convenient rulebook with a tutorial, but whatever. I will again harp on how they made a turn called a round and a round called a turn. Actually, Alex told me we should just suck it up and use the game terminology, but no, I can't for my sanity. A turn is a turn, a round is a round. I did some online snooping, and it's pretty much universally agreed that a turn is shorter than a round, so how they swap this in a deluxe edition is beyond me. Okay, repeat after me. A collection of turns is a round. A collection of turns is a round. Many turns is one round. Round bigger than turns. Okay, so now for gameplay cons. So the first, which is a minor one, is how some of the connections between countries are pretty nonsensical thematically, which makes gameplay confusing. Okay, this will make more sense with an example. Why is Turkey considered in Western Europe, even though it's all the way to the right side of Eastern Europe? If it's going to be so out here, it has to be more obvious that it's part of Western Europe. Like, look how close Turkey is to the USSR. To a newcomer, how would this be Western Europe? Okay, so I guess the board is supposed to be ideologically minded if Turkey is West Europe, like how Canada is Western Europe. But then how come some countries aren't connected by this logic? South Africa doesn't touch Zimbabwe or Southeastern African states. Why? So the reality of this is that there's a lot of things they did to choke point the game. So it's kind of inevitable of this game design, but it is a touch confusing how countries are connected the way they are. We get it. It's pretty much impossible to reach a perfect conclusion here. It's just going to be inherently hard for newcomers and people that are really into history and don't understand the connections here. And by reading the back of the rulebook's little design diary, they considered many things for country adjacencies, like the domino theory for Soviet ideas spreading. It's just that we ended up having the final product like this. It's a bit confusing, but ultimately necessary. Next gameplay con is this card, the Olympic Games. It's a card where the gameplay doesn't quite really hit the theme because if your opponent boycotts it, it's really bad for them. So they're pretty much never going to boycott it. Also, like, realistically, are you really going to lower Defcon out of not going to some sporting event? Seems odd. Nuclear war off not showing to the Olympics. Really? Also, to make it even weirder, if you're playing the Olympic Games as the Soviets and the Americans don't show up, then the Defcon goes to 1. The Soviets lose the game for hosting the Olympics. You caused nuclear Armageddon from hosting Olympics. What? That's super unintuitive. The second gameplay con is that the USSR is much stronger than the US in early game. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing if you play this game a lot and are really comfortable with everything. The US will get a lot stronger in the mid to late game to really balance out the power levels. However, due to Twilight Struggle being long and not the most accessible game already, this can just lead to frequent USSR game blowouts, and I feel like you're not really playing the game your first couple times playing. Our solution to this is what they use for tournaments. That is to just have the US add 2 influence anywhere they control at the game start. Unfortunately, this imbalance also makes the game time just really hard to pin down. Yes, the USSR can win the early war really hard.
Eat lead.
Like, let's say they're up 10 VP by scoring the Middle East and Asia. The game might go to 3 hours if you go to late game, or it might be 30 minutes if someone blows up Defcon early. Also, you can have effectively won but still be playing. So let's say the USSR can win the early war really hard. So the USSR can pretty much just have the game in the bag with a huge point buffer, and then the game just keeps going on for another 1 to 2 hours to just end in a Soviet victory anyways. Throughout these 1 to 2 hours, the USA is relying on just getting extremely lucky through Hail Mary dice rolls, like doing a great Indo-Pakistan roll to suddenly wrest control, or coup a 3-strength region, meaning they probably need to roll a perfect 6. Basically, they just need to keep rolling 6s at the right time. This gets us to our final con, which is that Twilight Struggle really suffers from a lot of output dice randomness which isn't well controlled and is just a single d6. Pretty much any pivotal thing like a coup or resolving text on an event is just 1d6. That's it. Like nowadays, there'd probably be some way to save a +1 or -1 to add to your dice roll later or have a reroll saved up. A simple fix that we settled on is it'd be so much nicer to have a 2d6 to reduce the variance, then just tweaking the text on cards. This would still allow for insanely lucky swings like rolling snake eyes or double sixes, but with way less frequency. And remember, because military ops is a thing, both players want to be moving that up. That means that every single round is going to have players doing coups, which is dice rolling. So there's crucial dice rolling every single round by both players. You just can't get out of the dice rolling, okay? Even if you're really good. Alex, who has played this game over 20 times, has said there has not been a single game of Twilight Struggle he's played where crazy luck wasn't a factor.
Da. For the Union.
Now, before the recommender score, we want to give a shout out to our patrons and people supporting us on Coffee. Patrons' names all over here. Thank you guys for supporting us to help make videos like this possible. It takes a long time to make something like this. Yeah, thank you guys so much. Our highest ranking patrons are Batman as a Cardboard. Thank you guys. Now let's get to the recommender score, where we try to critically evaluate the aforementioned pros and cons with the caveat of whether or not this is even a good idea in the first place. And this is a game where the USA and the USSR just squared off during the Cold War, trying to wrest control of countries and then regions that are made out of countries. This is all done through cards that can be played as events or for their number. And then also we have the scoring cards, which you have to get rid of to actually get victory points. And so with all that into consideration, Twilight Struggle, this previous BGG #1 game, is going to get a recommended score of 8 out of 10, it is great. This is just one of those historical products where it's just utter brilliance how they're able to pinpoint so many crucial elements of about 45 years and drop them into one competitive game as events in a shared deck building system before Dominion was out. It must have taken them so long to first come up with what events make the cut, then tweak them to make sense with all the op numbers. If you're a history buff, you'll probably already get so much enjoyment by just going through the deck of cards and seeing why they assigned the numbers they did, or which events would delete themselves, and why others stay in the game permanently. Yet Twilight Struggle is also an odd recommendation to those who aren't huge history buffs. We strongly suggest for you to have at least some knowledge of what's going on throughout these decades, so then you can actually know what to do during turns. And even with that knowledge, there is some deep speed bumps in your first games. And then to make it all worse, the Soviets are just stronger than the Americans at first to give you those early blowout games. You really gotta know that Southeast Asia only scores once, or South America is kind of bland early game to invest in, etc, etc. It's really not a game where one guy can just try stuff out and see what happens and have a normal feeling result. It's one of those experiences that expects you to at the very least know about the news of the time. Without knowing much of what's in each set of early, middle, and late war cards, the card draws can feel a little bit like chance, and as such you're just fighting to fend off your opponent's events and playing damage control, where in reality you should be carefully calculating how you'll handle each region as the decades progress and cards are slowly deleted forever. I would classify this as this game having a lot of isms, as in it has a lot of Twilight Struggle isms, where certain cards just need to be known about, like Blockade. It just has to be played around if you're playing as the USA, otherwise you lose West Germany and it's super hard to get back. That's bad for you in Europe. Or how late game Star Wars lets the US go through the discard pile to grab a non-scoring card of their choice. So you can grab War Games that was supposed to be permanently discarded because you think the deck's not going to reshuffle this late in the game. Now War Games is in your hand, now you play it and you'll win the game through War Games suddenly. Or how Our Man in Tehran just throws off the pattern of deck shuffling because it discards cards from the top of the draw pile. There's also the huge particular Twilight Struggle ism that is the realignment mechanic. Yes, now dozens and dozens of minutes into this video, we can finally bring up this thing we talked about once in passing and how to play. It's the very first action on your player aid, but it's the most rarely used, where each player rolls a die and then you can add certain modifiers to your dice roll, like if you're next to control adjacent countries. The high roller may remove the difference between the rolls from the opponent's influence on the target, and then you can have both players roll as many times as the op number on your card. The reason why this is rarely used is because it relies on pure chance for changing control of country influence. Hey, I rolled a 6, it's pretty good. But normally if you're doing a dice roll, well then you might as well just do a coup to get military ops as well, or just spend the card to get the guaranteed op number printed on the card. But sometimes realignment is really good if you have a bunch of adjacencies on the map, so it's again something that has a very particular use case and veterans will know how to utilize it once a game. Probably. Maybe they'll use it twice. Twilight Struggle is also just not going to be 100% thematically bulletproof. Like we mentioned, some weird country adjacencies and cons, and also how some cards are just a little odd. We got some more. Brush War is a failure of theme in that you can do it in what the heck, Italy? But then there is NATO to stop that from happening, so not a huge deal. Or how someone can lose the game from duck and covering. I tell people to go under their desk and that causes nuclear Armageddon? Maybe Defcon loss should be off the person who moves it to 1. Twilight Struggle is also just a highly confrontational game by its push and pull nature of countries. You're not really gaining ground somewhere without taking away from your opponent, and it's very punishing if you have the wrong cards used or even saved. Twilight Struggle just also has a ton of swingy dice rolling randomness, and you gotta be okay with just failing coups and thus having wasted turns. Or that you felt really secure on the board, and then suddenly your opponent decides to do a Hail Mary coup and they roll a 6, now they're back in the game. That's how it is. But anyways, in our games, we only got to late game once because I kept losing before that because of Defcon going to 1. And out of Alexander's 20 to 30 games, he only saw it go to late game about half the time. So yeah, you're not going to be seeing those late game cards too often. But with so many playthroughs, now he's very familiar with these ridiculous late game cards for the Yankees. Well, ranked high, this is really not for everyone, with plenty more historical 1v1 games that came out since 2005. But the sheer beauty of what it does well, that is putting these American versus USSR struggles with all the narrative cards around the globe with a great card system, this just appeals strongly to people who will see past its rough edges, have an encyclopedia knowledge of all the card events, and easily give this game a 9 or 10 out of 10. And I suspect more and more of these people are playing this online at this point, because playing digitally roughs out a lot of the component and learning woes for a faster game time. And again, to truly enjoy Twilight Struggle, you gotta get through the initial struggle. And Twilight Struggle is a game that, if it was released today, would be nowhere near the BGG success it is now. First of all, look at how many games were produced in 2005. Now look at how many games are being produced in 2024. It's pretty ridiculous how far the industry has gone, and also how BGG's ranking system now seems to skew a lot more heavily towards Euro and cooperative games. Twilight Struggle being replaced by Pandemic Legacy Season 1 really does feel like a type of involuntary passing of the throne. And then it was Gloomhaven there, and now it's not a co-op anymore, but still a Euro at Brass Birmingham. The BGG user base has changed as well as the games being designed as the years went on. And look, Twilight Struggle is the only GMT game currently in the BGG top 100. Like, if Twilight Struggle is the most BGG favored game from 2005, what would be the most BGG favored game from last year that was also a thematic 1v1 card dueler? And for 2004, this would be Lord of the Rings Duel, a much different game. So yeah, just feel free to try Twilight Struggle out digitally before buying an actual deluxe edition from a different era of board gaming. It came out 20 years ago and shines more and more as you get to that 20+ playthrough mark. Also, you can check out all these games that have a similar card system but are differently themed.
Kirov reporting.
I would give Twilight Struggle an 8 out of 10. It is a game I am almost always interested in playing. I love the theme, and I mostly enjoy the mechanics. Nothing in Twilight Struggle is particularly high fidelity, but I do think there's a lot of soul in plenty of the cards and also on the board, especially once all the influence markers start to spread around. I like the way the space race track looks. I also like the way the turn or the round track looks. Otherwise, I think the theme comes through strong enough in the art that does exist and the board, such as it is, that I'm content with the components, even though they could certainly be truly deluxe. Where I think Twilight Struggle really shines is its gameplay. Your average player doesn't really get the full breadth of the enjoyment one can receive from playing Twilight Struggle on the first play. For me, I didn't really get to that point until I had played it maybe 10 times or 15 times. And once I reached that point, the game sort of totally expanded for me and it became wildly more fun. And I think the principal reason for that is because I knew what most of the cards in the game were. I was able to make informed decisions about what I needed to do and what my opponent could do in response to those things, or at least what they could possibly do. When you sit down to play a game of Twilight Struggle, when you've played it as many times as I have, you start to think about things like, oh, well, if I'm playing as America, I need to put a point into the Philippines. I need to put a point into Malaysia. I need to develop, as if we're playing chess, I need to develop into Colombia at some point. So that way I can get into Venezuela and maybe I can trigger a USSR coup in Colombia and then we'll be at Defcon 3 and then I can coup somewhere else in the Middle East. And because the board is so expansive and there's so many cards in the game, but not so many that you'll be overwhelmed, that level of decision making feels sort of similar to chess, but it's much more fun for me. I'm a fan of Cold War history.
Acknowledged.
I enjoy this theme. I also like 1 versus 1 area control games. I do think the game out of the box can struggle a little bit. There are many powerful early war cards for the Soviet Union. Decolonization is one of the best cards in the game, and it stays the best until the end of the game. But there are other strong ones too, like Vietnam Revolts or De-Stalinization. And these cards are really strong because they allow the Soviet player to expand to places that they are not normally in when the game starts, on top of just applying a lot of influence around the board. The US doesn't really have anything comparable except perhaps the Marshall Plan, but the Marshall Plan is one of the US's few 4-ops cards, so spending it for its event is actually sort of a feels bad moment, because by playing it, you will also enable the USSR player to play NATO and burn it out of the deck forever, which means you can't draw it subsequently in the future. And the US doesn't really get to catch up until the mid-war starts, and they have a lot of powerful cards in the mid-war, like the Ussuri River Skirmish or Colonial Rear Guards, which are powerful. They're basically the same cards as what the USSR had in the early war, or puppet governments.
High speed, low drag.
So the US can get a lot of ground made in the mid-war with extremely powerful cards, but because the card system is random, you are just drawing them off the top of the deck, and there's very few ways to get cards. You have to either play Our Man in Tehran or Ask Not What Your Country Can Do For You. And if neither of those get played, then you're basically just at the mercy of card draws. And so you might not see what you need to see until round 6, sorry. And that can lose the US player the game. So my biggest cons with Twilight Struggle are basically its reliance on randomness, and principally randomness that feels bad for the player. I've already talked about the card drawing randomness that could screw you over. Of course, if you draw those powerful cards on turn 4, round 4, or round 5, then you're in a fantastic position as the US player. But if you don't get them till later, then the game might just be over. I do really enjoy the Defcon system, the push and pull of the Defcon, how you will basically always be sitting at Defcon 3 or 2, and it's really up to the Soviet player off the rip to decide, are we going to Defcon 2 because I'm going to coup a battleground country and thus prevent you from coupping any battleground countries this go, and thus denying the military ops value that you need for victory points? Or am I going to perhaps coup a non-BG like Colombia to get myself into South America? And I think it's these choices that really make Twilight Struggle sing, and the more you play it, the more you will naturally start to see all of these different choices appear before you. But this sort of directly ties into the problem of bad randomness, which is that coups are an essential part of the game. So you'll be rolling a lot of D6s, and there's very, very few ways that you can mitigate your risk. If you're coupping a 1 or a 2 stab country, you can spend a 4 ops card and be guaranteed something. Even if you roll a 1, you will at least do something. If you are coupping a 3 stability country, you're guaranteed nothing. Even the most powerful ops card in the game, the China card, cannot guarantee you a effect. The coupping system as it stands is extremely impactful to who will win the game. If you get lucky on your coup rolls, you have a much higher chance of winning the game than if you don't, because coups can be so much more explosive. But you're equally as likely to roll a 1 on a coup instead of a 6. So if you do that and you're coupping, I don't know, Italy or Thailand, and you're using a 3 ops card, then you did nothing, and that feels terrible. My suggestion is turn a coup roll from a 1d6 into just 2d6, and then we take the stability number of the country, and instead of doubling it, we triple it. This should mean that your average result, assuming you're spending a 3 ops card to coup, is going to be around a 10. So if you have a 3 stability country, you triple it, that's a 9, you're likely to have at least some effect on a fairly consistent result if you're coupping a 3 stability country. At least from a player feedback, it would feel a lot better to coup a place and at least do something, because the gap between 2 stability and 3 stability currently is way off. It is like new players aren't really gonna know that a 3 stability country is a foolish country to try to coup versus a 2, which is basically a done deal. I've played with the Year Zero expansion, so I played with some of the unique starting scenarios and the unique cards that the factions get. And I think they're kind of hit or miss. You know, some of them feel way too powerful. Other ones are like, doesn't even change anything meaningfully. Kremlin Flu, I think is what the card is called. That card is insanely powerful. That is an unbelievably powerful US card. Yeah, I don't really have much else to talk about. I think the game would be better if there were just more cards. Like, there's nothing involving Scandinavia, which is sad, outside of Marshall Plan, which I don't think that counts.
My personal score for Twilight Struggle is going to be a 4 out of 10. I have a below average time with it. Yes! Now I can finally disclose my full backstory with this game because, man, it's been a journey with this one. I first found this game because number 1 in BGG, right? You gotta try it. So this was back in high school when we were trying the top 10 that we liked, like Caverna and Android Netrunner come to mind. So I sleeved the cards, trudged through the rulebook, and on a sleepy, warm Sunday, I invited one of my good friends from high school over, and we just couldn't really get through it around. It was just too much for our 17-year-old brains at the time. So we just looked at the game, looked at the cards, and just went like, yeah, we'll return to this someday. There's not really much art here. There's not really much of the Cold War we're really drawn to, so we'll put it away, play it another day, and we didn't play it again. And a couple years ago, I just sold the game. I just couldn't be bothered to play it again. Every time I look at the box and the board, I'm like, whatever. Maybe I'll play it digitally one day. But now it's about 10 years later, and of course we have a copy now, and I'm much better at games, and I've played many other GMT games so I can deal with the GMT-isms, so I went all in again, which probably wouldn't happen if Alexander wasn't here to teach me all the rules. Twilight Struggle surely has the gravitas of an amazing game design behind it. I just gotta play it, right? I just gotta play it more. I'm dumb. So I poured in 3 games, and I'm still 4 out of 10 on it. The game still doesn't look pretty to me, where it's just colors on the board and then drab black and white in my hand. And components don't feel good. I don't like the GMT style of components. They're just too small and drab. You can't see them. The push and pull of countries is cool. The cards are interesting. Turns are tense. And I feel like I'm getting a constant history lesson with all the events triggering. And I'd say that early game, as in the first hour, is a 6 or 7 out of 10 as I know all the events. But man, am I just confused about scoring cards still because that feels oddly technical. But I'm sure I would adjust to that over time. But you know what happened as the game progressed past the 1.5 to 2 hours? Well, I just didn't know much about these mid to late game war cards, especially since it wasn't covered in high school in AP American history. Yeah, we never got that far. And it was something I never bothered to research myself because I just wasn't that interested in it. And then so Twilight Struggle started to feel a lot more abstract as these cards are coming out and I'm just disconnected from what they're doing. That leads to gameplay just feeling like op numbers on the board, and that is pretty dry and I'm just not that invested. Yes, maybe I'm more uncultured than I thought. Oh, also some cards just feel way too convoluted for what they are. Like look at Missile Envy, so much text and things to do for basically just taking an opponent's card from their hand and forcing them to play it, which feels very out of place in a game that's all about careful hand management. The main thing that this is really getting to is that the central gameplay loop isn't exactly satisfying to me in the long term. While playing cards from hand is cool, scanning the board to see which nation you need to nudge towards you is engaging to check dominance of each region, but it just gets tiring to do for hours and hours, and on top of that, there's no sexy moment in a round, no hype moment for me to personally look forward to. Actually, a surprising amount of the game feels bad, as your hand is filled with opponent's cards and you're just playing crisis management. It gets even worse if you have a bad dice roll, something I don't usually care about much, but losing a turn just feels worse when I already feel like things are constantly spiraling downwards. Yes, I'm a noob at this game. Oh, also the space race just feels like such a buzzkill to me, where you have to first roll to succeed, so if you fail, you literally just wasted a turn. That feels bad in a game like this. Then second, if you get to the end, the reward isn't even that good for all your effort, which I guess is correct thematically, but a bit silly gameplay wise when I'm committing so much time to it, though this surely becomes less annoying once you play the game a ton. The fact that you're collectively deck building a deck by removing cards is cool, but the fact that you have to play your opponent's bad cards to trash them makes it not feel like satisfying deck building, and nothing like the usually feels good progression of deck building. Like you're also deleting your good cards if you play them as events, huh? Much of in between rounds is just praying I get the scoring cards I want and none of the opponent's event cards, which doesn't happen. You're always going to get their event cards. Then the sudden death through the Defcon triggering just felt like a huge gotcha thing that really killed my enjoyment. And it's like, and this is a reoccurring idea, well, you just gotta play the game more, right? But I'm already not hugely invested in the theme, and if I want real history, I'd visit World War I or II or ancient history or medieval history. Yeah, probably anything but Cold War, honestly. Okay, this isn't a 3 out of 10 because there are some interesting, satisfying moments, like getting a coup to land, or after rounds of manipulating all the influence around a region to get everything to line up perfectly for a scoring card to get that VP swing. But these moments of some cool barely outweigh the bad, especially when the game is getting into hour 3. You know how I said in the recommender score that this game is very confrontational? And since I'm not enjoying the mechanics that much, even though they're enough to keep me engaged. I'm playing this game very competitively, and then it just feels really bad to keep losing. And I'm at that plateau in the skill curve where I'm kind of comfortable with the early game cards, but not at all comfortable with the mid, and especially the late game cards. And to get more comfortable with those, I need to play a lot more games, which is a lot more not fun. Right now, I'd easily get crushed by anyone who played this game probably more than 4 times. But also the board being mostly static every game, because it is the beginning of the Cold War, doesn't really give me that much motivation to play again, even though your cards technically are different in hand. And I was thinking more about the Cold War and how zoomed out this game's timeline is as a result. It's just speeding through years that just makes events feel like a drop in a barrel from a gameplay sense. When in fact, I think I'd enjoy it a lot more if the game just purely focused on an event, like the Arab-Israeli War or the Vietnam Revolts. So something more akin to Coin's historical scope of a couple of years, but I got my problems with the Coin system too, haha. Okay, I'm 27 years old, I was born much later than the end date of this game here, 1989, and I'm the son of Chinese immigrants. My family and close friends practically have no relationship to any of these Cold War events. It's not something that was even discussed growing up, the Cold War. I'd have to research it on my own. I'm just far younger than what this game's target demographics are. Of course, Alexander is about my age and he's just kind of a weirdo. He likes this game. Anyways, GMT, thanks again for cementing the fact that I just don't really care about the Cold War. But man, impressive deck building system by deleting events, that's always kind of interesting to think about. And remember, this was a game before Dominion was even released. 4 out of 10.